Section 1 of The National Geographic Magazine, Volume 9, November 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in July 2021. Sumatra's West Coast by David G. Fairchild, United States Department of Agriculture. The island of Sumatra is undoubtedly one of the most valuable of all the Dutch possessions in the East. Its resources are almost wholly undeveloped, and its interior is scarcely even known, only one or two expeditions ever having crossed the island in its widest part. It contains a great variety of mineral and vegetable products, and its trackless forests are filled with still unconquered tribes of men, remarkable cannibals among them, numerous rhinoceroses, and large herds of elephants. It possesses a chain of verdure-clad volcanoes which give to its west coast one of the most salubrious climates in the archipelago, and its scenery surpasses in beauty the famous scenery of Java, which has been called the most beautiful tropical island in the world. The island is held by a small force of Dutch and native soldiers and governed by a body of Dutch officials scattered along the coast cities, whose control over the natives is more moral than physical. That such a marvelous island should have remained so long comparatively unexplored simply illustrates the slowness with which the work of exploration is being conducted by the Dutch home government, which hampers in every way the movements of the more progressive colonial government. As American interests in the East are increasing, the readers of this magazine may find acceptable a few notes regarding one of the largest and certainly the most beautiful island of the whole archipelago. Miss Sidmore has called Java the Garden of the East in her charming account of travel among its miniature bamboo villages and paddy fields. Sumatra is compared by the Dutch, although incomparably grander and totally different, to Switzerland. You approach Java with a feeling of how beautiful and lovable everything seems, but as you steam into Emma Harbor on Sumatra's west coast, your mind is overpowered by the sight of the verdure-covered volcanoes and trackless forests stretching away into the unknown and undiscovered. The western coast of this wonderful island, famed among the Dutch as Het Bovenland van Sumatra, is as near a tropical Switzerland, if such an appellation does not convey a confused notion, as is to be found anywhere on the globe. New Zealand can boast of glaciers of surpassing beauty, justly entitling it to the place it holds as the Switzerland of the southern hemisphere. But I am confident that after the sources of the Amazon have been thrown open to the tourist, and Orizaba has been surrounded by winter hotels, the most luxuriant vegetation and most wildly fascinating scenery in the world will be sought for among the chain of volcanoes that forms the backbone of Sumatra. There are several ways of visiting Sumatra, none being very direct, but the pleasantest is to take one of the comfortable steamers of the Koninklijke Paketvaart Maatschappij, either from the island of Penang, where tourists call going either way around the world, and steam west to the north point of the island and southward along its western coast to Padang, the principal port. Or do as my friend Mr. Barbara Lathrop and I did, leaving Batavia on the north coast of Java and steaming west through the Straits of Sunda past the famous volcano of Krakatoa and northward along the coast, stopping at Padang over one steamer and catching the next, which landed us finally at Penang. The city of Padang seemed on the first night of arrival one of the hottest and wettest places it were possible for water and sunshine to concoct, but where the sunlight pours down its rays perpendicularly, and the clouds every afternoon empty an almost unlimited quantity of water, palms are able to live a life really becoming such royal representatives of the vegetable kingdom. You feel oppressed with the inconceivable power of the living matter, the protoplasm, which surrounds you. In temperate regions you have become accustomed to the supremacy of man. He cuts down and destroys and clears big patches of ground free almost of every living thing. Here you feel as if the plants merely tolerated your presence. The hotels serve to distract your attention from nobler thoughts by their insufficiencies and limited capacity. I have often wondered what a party of Cook's tourists would do if they landed and found only 4 or 5 beds at the disposition of new arrivals and not sufficient bananas to go around. To be met at your first meal in the tropics, when you look forward to reveling in the delicious new sorts of bananas, with the incomprehensible statement of "Tidak ada lagi," which, being interpreted by your Dutch acquaintance, means "there are no more," is a hard and unforgettable experience, the more inexplicable since the level plains about the town are filled with immense banana plantations. One small banana is not enough for an appetite whetted by a long ocean voyage. This is, however, an introduction to one of the many peculiarities of the tropics, which irritate you until you find the absurdity of being irritated by the unavoidable. Padang as a town has nothing to recommend it. Its public buildings and houses are embowered in the most gorgeous tropical vegetation, but they themselves are plain and look as if they were moth-eaten. Termites work rapidly upon the corner posts, and decay soon makes new buildings old. Then, too, the malarial plasmodium finds in the region a most congenial home, and the pallid faces and slow gait of the Europeans tell too plainly of an unequal struggle between blood corpuscles and the invading army of parasites. I do not know that Padang is celebrated for its fevers, though it is certainly not a healthy place. But it is for other reasons that travelers do not stay long in Padang. As the terminus of a most remarkable mountain railroad, worthy of a Meigs, one of the earliest cog railways ever constructed for freight purposes, it affords the traveler unrivaled opportunities to "get into the interior," as explorers express it. The Ombilin coal fields send to Padang by means of this road the coal for the Netherlands steamship line, which calls here both in and outbound. It is not a great way from this region that some of the petroleum fields have been discovered, which the Standard Oil Company tried in vain to get control of, being checked, so the newspapers report, by a suspicious paternal home government which wishes to hold everything valuable in its own hands. Stretches of low swampy jungle line the track on both sides. Thickets of the atap palm, with its creeping stem and rigid upright leaves, whose leaflets flutter incessantly in the slightest breeze, rise out of deep, weed-overgrown pools, suggestive of all sorts of serpents, leeches, and water insects. Immense plantations of bananas, overgrown with masses of tangled morning glories with their light blue blossoms, have crowded out the more varied natural vegetation in places, and stand as evidences of the cultural skill and indomitable energy of those greatest of all tropical colonizers, the Chinese. But soon the train whirled us into the Kloof or gorge itself, and for several hours our eyes were busy with scenes of the most gorgeous freshness and beauty. The charm of tropical verdure is largely due, I believe, to the abundance of broad-leaved plants which it contains. Nothing illustrates this more than a comparison of such plants as the banana or talipod palm with a South African fine-leaved heath or a North woods pine. As individuals, all are beautiful, perhaps equally so, but the water-colors of the tropics are painted in splashes and with a broad, free hand, while the foliage of the temperate regions is painfully etched on copperplate. This gorge is compared by the Dutch with the Gotthardstrasse below Andermatt, but they belittle it by such comparison, for the Kloof van Anne, with its countless waterfalls, rushing mountain streams, cloud-covered hillsides, and floating mists, added to its endless variety of flowering shrubs, feathery fern fronds, waving palms, and tall, imposing forest trees, makes a composition of the first rank among scenic masterpieces, and entitles it to the first place on the line of the world's gallery. Padang Pajang, a village some 700 meters above the sea level, with a comfortable hotel of brick and thatch, after the Dutch style, forms a most delightful stopping place just above the gorge. The natives here, although of the Malay race, are quite distinct from those of the island of Java or the peninsula of Malacca. They are a well-to-do, even wealthy race, and build costly houses of indisputable beauty, making them of teak or other wood, paneling them with great care, carving and painting them after patterns often of considerable taste and beauty. The roof structure, with their gables rising one above the other, resemble more those of the Siamese temple than any other Oriental structures. The floors of nearly all sag in the middle, and the ends of the houses are raised on high posts, frequently carved and sometimes filled with bamboo wicker-work. They are often communal in nature, as many as 3 or 4 families living in the same dwelling. In front of each dwelling house stands a small square building, more highly decorated often than the house itself, which is used for a godang or rice granary, and no native compound of houses is complete without such a godang. The interiors of these houses are not without modern conveniences in the way of comfortable beds, with pillows and canopies, the better of the latter being often decorated with curious and showy pendant ornaments made entirely of the white pith of some tropical plant. These houses are more comfortable than those of any other race in the Dutch East Indies, and seem luxurious when compared with the dirty hovels of the Maoris or the pebble-floored homes of the Samoans. Although my friend and I were prepared by the enthusiastic accounts of the Dutch officials to see a more comely race than the Javanese in Sumatra, we were surprised and charmed by the picturesque and highly colored costumes of the natives. Nowhere did we see these costumes so abundant or striking as at a little market or pasar halfway to the larger market of Kubu Krambil, to which we drove behind a crazy pair of ponies in a very uncomfortable herdic. There, in a little clearing in the dense vegetation, about one of the prettiest of native public houses, where public declarations are made and cockfights witnessed, was gathered the most effectively gaudy and picturesque group of natives I had ever seen. Immense Roman and Egyptian-like headdresses, carefully colored sarongs tightly but gracefully folded about the shapely forms, jackets of soft, loosely woven black, trimmed with gold and silver braid, and bracelets and bangles in great profusion, reminded one of a gala day in some Italian or Spanish town. But the most curious feature of the native dress is their earrings, or ear buttons, as they would be more properly called, for they are sometimes an inch or more in diameter and of light but solid metal. All stages in the preparation of the ear for the reception of these buttons were to be found. There were mere babies with a single small puncture, sweet-faced children of 4 with a coiled bit of springy banana leaf rolled tightly and passed through the puncture to continually expand it to the proper diameter by the pressure of the unrolling leaf, and graceful young bells with gold and silver buttons tastefully elaborated as large as the top of an after-dinner coffee cup. The young girls, we were told, could wear their earrings or not as they chose, but if they knew how ugly they looked when the buttons are removed, and the lobe of the ear appears as a loop of gristle which dangles and flaps against the cheek, they would wear them always. Upon marriage, however, the bride must wear the buttons, as with us the wedding ring. After the birth of the first child, or when 5 years have elapsed, she must take them out and lay them aside. The old women are generally ugly, as they have buttonless ears, though as far as their other features go, they are remarkably well preserved. Then, too, there is more significance in the dress of these natives than there is in that of the Javanese. If a woman is poor, she wears a single dark skirt or sarong. If she is well-to-do, she puts a second, more costly, over it, covering all but the bottom. If she is rich, she puts on a third, covering the major part of the second, and if she is very rich, she dons a fourth. The strange carved and gilded light wooden head-dresses, and still stranger box-like bracelets, as well as the delicately formed bangles and diamond-set pins and bracelets, one of which we priced and found to be worth $150, testify to a skill as gold workers which rivals that of the natives of British India. The golden sarongs, for which the women ask $50 or more apiece, are too somber and in this regard are disappointing, lacking that originality of pattern we are used to attribute to the Orient. The silver filigree work of the men, were you not on the other side of the world, you would swear was made in Mexico, it so nearly resembles it in fineness of detail and originality of design. Their beaten ware and heavier pieces are distinctly inferior to the British Indian work. The surroundings of Padang Panjang rival the famous scenes from the little Javanese town of Buitenzorg, accounted one of the 3 or 4 most beautiful spots in the world. The sunsets over the volcanoes Singalang and Merapi, with their low drifting clouds of peculiar violet, purple, and lilac hues, form sights never to be forgotten. The famous sunsets in the Indian Ocean are no more wonderful. Pathways lead off from the well-traveled road at every turn, and you have only to follow one of these for a few minutes to find yourself in the midst of the most luxuriant forest, with over-towering bamboos and tree ferns, palms and flowering shrubs, thickets of impenetrable rattan palms, low bushes over which immense numbers of large black ants are running, moist moss-covered banks, a tangled mass of liverworts, filmy ferns and lichens, with here and there an insect so closely resembling the bits of lichen that even an expert entomologist might pass it by unnoticed. Close by the path, in one of the most fascinating of these many valleys, there was growing a clump of bamboo, some of the shoots of which, although 80 feet or more in height, were evidently newly grown, with leaves still immature. I shook one of these young shoots lightly with my hands, and, to my surprise, the whole top, 15 feet or more in length, snapped off, and, falling at my feet, was broken into a half-dozen fragments. Few experiences could give one a better idea of the rapid growth of plants in the tropics than this, growing like a giant asparagus shoot at the rate of a foot or more a day. In a short 3 months it is a tree of the forest towering above the tops of many century-old monarchs, and yet, after all, it is botanically nothing but a grass. Though acquainted with the luxuriance of vegetation for which Java is justly celebrated, I was little prepared for the overwhelming exuberance of growth around Padang Panjang, and when the time came for us to leave, I was almost ready to abandon the enticing trip already promised me by my friend in favor of a little longer sojourn amid its beauties. Fort de Kock, our next stopping place, 940 meters above the sea, is known all over the Dutch East Indies as a sanatorium for the Dutch army. Officers and men are sent there from other portions of the archipelago to recover from the malarial fever or the beriberi, the 2 most prevalent and dangerous diseases of this portion of the world. The cool, dry mountain air soon fits them for active service again. The town itself has little of interest. The hotel, filled as it is with convalescent soldiers and their faithful wives, is poor enough, being kept by half-castes with more kindliness than business ability. The surrounding country is open prairie, dotted with clumps of bamboo and bits of thick woodland, and makes a very different impression from the scenery about Padang Panjang. The native villages, surrounded by fruit trees and patches of upland rice, contain a well-to-do race of people, some of whom manufacture jewelry, expensive gold-woven cloths, and beaten silverware, Kota Gedong being the center for this kind of work. It was interesting to notice the independence of the native women, which in fact is one of their marked characteristics, either an outgrowth or consequence of their marriage customs. A man and a woman, upon marrying, do not form a home of their own, but the husband remains among his own circle of relations, and resides only temporarily with his wife. The children remain with her, and inherit all her property and a half of that earned by their father and mother together. The remaining half goes to their father's sisters or to the children of those sisters. From Fort de Kock to the little village of Pajo Kombo, the end of this branch of the railroad, is only a few miles. It is the farthest inland town that can be reached by rail, and its principal street, a broad, straight avenue of casuarinas, is lined on either side with innumerable small villages and curious mesigids or Mohammedan temples. Near the center of this avenue is a large open square or market-place, in which on pasar or market days the natives gather with their curious wares. It is on such market days that the Pajo Kombo women, noted all over the Dutch East Indies for their beauty, are to be seen arrayed in their costly sarongs and decked out with their bangles, ear-buttons, and bracelets. Whether or not we really saw a special market or pasar bezar, I do not know, but there were thousands of people there whose customs to our eyes did not compare favorably with those worn at the modest little pasar near Padang Panjang. Few sights can surpass a Malay pasar, however, in interest. There is a wonderful array of strange fruit and vegetables, devices for striking fire, children's toys, ornaments for headdresses, cooking utensils, cloths of bright but tastefully blended colors, and a whole host of light refreshments, palm wines, peanut cheeses covered with heavy growths of green and yellow molds, pineapple sauces, inviting-looking curries, and cooling drinks innumerable. The livestock market nearby showed that the resources of the island in this direction were excellent, as cattle after the Alderney type, and hogs, tough little ponies, goats, and Indian buffalo were exhibited in profusion. One visits Pajo Kombo because it is the nearest point to the Kloof or gorge of Harau and the waterfalls of Batang Harau, called by the Dutch the Lauterbrunnen and Staubbach respectively of their Indies. It is curious to note how the Dutch compare scenes in Sumatra with noted points of interest in Switzerland, whereas in fact there is little comparison and absolutely no similarity, the rugged grandeur of Switzerland in no sense recalling the foliage-softened outlines of Sumatra. An hour's ride in an uncomfortable native cart brought us to the entrance of this little-known but certainly most wonderful gorge. As we approached, the tall gray marble cliffs rose perpendicularly before us to a height of 200 or 300 meters. On either side, like silken threads, we counted 15 waterfalls tumbling down from the tableland above. The niches and crevices of this gray marble formed footholds for the most varied of tropical plants, and these in their growth covered great patches with luxuriant verdure or brilliant coloring. Bathed in spray from the waterfalls, there were countless tropical ferns and lichens, algae, liverworts, and mosses. Through the gorge, at places not more than 70 feet wide, flowed a stream of clear water, its banks and bed clothed with insectivorous water plants and overhung with flowering shrubs and rank-growing grasses and sedges. The fall of Batang Harau suggested by its height and volume the Staubbach near Lauterbrunnen, but at its foot is a mass of moss and fern-covered boulders instead of the barren shale worn by tourists' feet. Instead of the flower-covered carpet of the Alps, the narrow valley was filled with palms, rank grasses, small rubber trees, and a host of strange shrubs and flowering plants, among them curious melastomas and a large orange-fruited fig, which decorated the cliffs with its fruit and foliage. No orchids were to be seen anywhere in the gorge, and it is possible that they had been taken out by some orchid hunter. After a morning spent in exploring the resources of this wonderful gorge, we returned to the comfortable little hotel at Pajakombo, where that most remarkable of rice lunches, the Reistafel, was being prepared for us. The next morning we returned by rail to Padang Panjang and passed again through the Kloof van Ane, where drifting clouds and occasional showers served to heighten the glory of its scenery. The comfortable steamer Maitserker of the Royal Packet Company, the great steamship monopoly of the archipelago, was at anchor the next day at Emma Harbour when we arrived by train from Padang. Over 500 soldiers were ticketed to leave by her, and the wharf was swarming with the soldiers and their wives. It was not either, as might be expected, a scene of leave-taking, for in the Dutch Indian Army the soldiers take their wives with them into the field, that is, a certain number of them chosen by lot for each company, native wives, be it understood. Decks were strewn with blankets and camp utensils, and every available inch of space was occupied. They were all bound for Aceh, the northern point of the island, where for the last 25 years the Dutch have been trying to conquer one of the most warlike and stubborn races of savages in all the Orient. For several months past the Dutch troops had been unusually active in Aceh, or Achin, as it is called in English, and this accounted for the large body of troops going north at this time. Little or nothing regarding these movements of the Dutch troops against the Achinese gets into our press, but nevertheless they are of a serious nature and entail yearly the sacrifice of many lives and the expenditure of large sums of money. That their campaigns are not prosecuted with that vigor which would seem to an American necessary and economical can scarcely be questioned, but certainly the difficulties of climate and position are great, and the bravery and persistence of the Dutch troops, who sooner or later fall victims to the dreaded malaria, are of the most praiseworthy character. The journey by sea up the west coast of Sumatra, unless it be made on one of the small coasting steamers, is generally uneventful. The low-lying islands of Nias and Puelo Tello, however interesting to a naturalist or ethnologist, are only low-lying islands of little interest as seen from the vessel. 2 whole days' steaming brought us to anchor in the roadstead of Olele, the port of the old capital of Achin, the fortified town of Kota Raja. Under the kind escort of the captain, we landed that Christmas morning and drove from the port a distance of several miles to Kota Raja. The city, which contains some 20,000 inhabitants, is surrounded by a 10-foot iron picket fence, through which access is gained at carefully guarded gateways. Inside the town lies the walled fort, where the officers' quarters are found, and which is also guarded, so that in case of a general attack it may form a place of retreat. A string of some 14 forts and blockhouses has been thrown, horseshoe-like with either end on the coast, about the town of Kota Raja, and are all connected by a narrow-gauge railroad with each other and with Kota Raja itself. The coaches are provided with iron plating and serve for the transport of supplies, of troops, and seemingly of school children as well, for, as we made our visit to the blockhouses along the line, some bright-looking girls scrambled in, books in hand, bound for the day school in Kota Raja, and they seemed quite as unconcerned as if no war was in progress, and heedless of the fact that from the jungle in the near distance might at any time issue a hail of bullets. These forts and blockhouses contain from 150 to 700 men each, and several Maxim guns. They are made of piles 10 or more feet high, driven closely together, and are protected by a mass of wire stretched over low iron posts, barbed wire fences, and a broad border of century plants arranged in closely planted rows. In fact, everything uncomfortable to bare feet is thrown about these stockades. For a half-mile or more about this line of blockhouses, the forest is entirely cleared away, leaving a clean sweep for the Maxim guns, while inside the line of railway the friendly natives are allowed to plant their rice. They are prevented, however, from harvesting it until they shall have spied out and delivered to the Dutch for punishment a certain number of their warlike neighbors. It would be hard to imagine a more uninteresting life than that led by the officers and soldiers who garrison these blockhouses. Narrow, low houses, with a single thickness of corrugated iron to keep out the heat of that burning tropical sun, few trees or often none to shed a grateful shade, and no intercourse with the outside world save through the occasional newspaper or magazine, no seasons, no change from the daily routine of the tropics, it is no wonder that cases of insomnia are frequent, and insanity one of the most dreaded of results. There are no more touching instances to be found of self-sacrifice than those of the wives of Dutch officers in Achin, who prefer short lives with their husbands under such uncomfortable conditions to long lives at home in snug little Holland. On our return to Kota Raja, we were shown through the truly wonderful army hospital, where patients both civil and military are cared for, and where, between April 24 and December 24 of 1896, 1,265 cases of wounded men and several thousand civilians and soldiers for diseases other than those arising from wounds were treated. The minor cases were treated in the hospitals of the various forts, and when we take into consideration the heavy % of deaths, we get an idea of the serious nature of the fighting. One corner was occupied by the cholera huts, temporary structures which are burned after each patient is treated and buried, for, according to the commanding surgeon's statement, no real cases of Asiatic cholera have, in his experiences, yielded to treatment. Achinese, Dutch, or Malay soldiers are faithfully treated, and though the Achinese, as soon as well and free, sometimes escape and return to their people to fight against the Dutch, when picked up as wounded prisoners they receive as careful treatment as though they were loyal subjects. Leaving Olele late that night, after a charming experience of Dutch hospitality, we anchored next morning off Segli, considered the most dangerous benteng or fort in Sumatra. Later in the day we landed at Telok Semawe, a fort further down the coast, protected by a most formidable series of high barbed wire fences and a gavy. There was an air about these blockhouses or bentengs reminding one forcibly of the Indian blockhouses of our forefathers, and should we see fit to undertake the control of such an archipelago as the Philippines, the training of our regulars as Indian fighters would come into excellent play, though the races there are perhaps not comparably as stubborn as these long, lithe, muscular Achinese. The trip from Telok Semawe to Penang was uneventful, and both my friend and I felt that in seeing this corner of the world our eyes had been opened to a war of more importance than we had either of us dreamed of finding there, and to the beauties of an island which has probably no equal for tropical beauty and grandeur in the world. End of section 1.